Queen Margaret of England stood defiantly on the field of battle, dead and dying men strewn around her. Her army had just crushed the traitors who'd imprisoned her husband and stolen her crown. 2 prisoners of war were brought before her, knights who had betrayed her. Her husband, the king, pleaded for their lives. He'd promised to spare them. Margaret silenced him with a look and called forth her 7-year-old son. She had something especially humiliating in mind, something her enemies would remember, and history would never forget. This is the story of Margaret of Anjou, the vengeful queen who inspired the character of Cersei Lannister. Margaret was born in France on March 23, 1430. Her father was René, Duke of Anjou, and her mother was Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine. Margaret was the niece by marriage of King Charles VII of France. By the time Margaret was a young woman, France and England had been fighting the 100 Years' War for, about 100 years or so. Margaret was offered as a wife to King Henry VI of England as part of a peace agreement. In 1444, at the age of 14, she was officially betrothed to Henry, who was 9 years her senior. She traveled to England to become queen the following year. Margaret was greeted by an elated public who saw her as a symbol of peace. Her procession through the city of London brought out enormous crowds, lining the streets and packing the rooftops. There were 8 separate plays performed to commemorate the occasion. It was such a big deal that it actually took her 2 days to progress through the city. It's hard to imagine what this 14-year-old girl must have been thinking as she witnessed an entire country going crazy just for her. In 1445, the English were definitely in the mood for peace with France. During the 100 Years' War, the English had conquered large portions of France. Henry VI's father, Henry V, had been a great hero, winning an immortal victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. But Henry V died when his son was only a few months old. Henry VI grew up as a fatherless child king with nobles jostling for the right to rule in his name. And they did a pretty bad job of it. Throughout his reign, the English gradually lost more and more of the land they'd conquered from the French. Unlike his father, Henry VI was no military genius. He was no Robert Baratheon either. Instead, he was shy, peace-loving, charitable, and pious. In other words, unfit to rule over a medieval society in a perpetual state of war. The fact that he was basically raised by advisors who dominated him didn't help either. But it would be one of the reasons Margaret was able to become so powerful later. Unlike Cersei, Margaret actually had a happy marriage. They were both interested in art and learning, and chose to spend free time together, something that was pretty rare in aristocratic marriages. But much like Cersei, the teenaged Margaret found that life as queen wasn't all it was cracked up to be. She quickly became unpopular due to events outside her control. Margaret's marriage contract came with a French truce, but Henry had also secretly agreed to give the territory of Maine back to the French as part of the deal. When the English people found out about this, they were furious. Margaret had also brought almost no dowry. The crown paid for the insanely expensive wedding, and the new queen had to be provided with lavish estates and a huge allowance from Parliament. It was also pointed out that Margaret had really been a weird match. She was only the French king's niece-in-law, pretty weak sauce by royal marriage standards. Finally, her union with Henry did not lead to peace. By 1449, the truce had broken down and the French began beating the snot out of the English again. People didn't exactly blame Margaret for these things, but within 4 years of welcoming their new queen with the biggest party the country had ever seen, everyone had buyer's remorse. Furthermore, there were whispers because she had yet to do the one thing people expected of the queen: get pregnant. No doubt her unpopularity and isolation left her feeling increasingly bitter. Margaret's closest friends at this time were William de la Pole, who had arranged her marriage, and his wife Alice. She was so close with William that many people believed the two were lovers. It was the beginning of an ugly rumor campaign that would have serious consequences later. De la Pole was Henry's most trusted advisor, so naturally people blamed him for the defeats in France, for choosing their unpopular queen, and for the general disaster that was Henry's reign. In 1450, de la Pole was forced to resign and go into exile, but before he could flee the country, he was seized by an angry mob and beheaded. De la Pole was replaced by the Duke of Somerset, who quickly also took his place in the Queen's affections. Things were finally looking up for Margaret in 1453. Early in that year, she announced that she was pregnant. After 8 years of marriage, the royal couple finally had an heir in the making. This news provided some much-needed stability to Henry's reign, but it would be very short-lived. In August of 1453, the English army was decisively crushed by the French at the Battle of Castillon, effectively ending the 100 Years' War. Shortly after receiving this news, Henry suffered a total mental breakdown. He awoke one morning in a daze, mumbling and groaning, his head twisting back and forth, unable to communicate. When Margaret gave birth to a boy in October, Henry didn't even notice. Doctors bled him, priests performed exorcisms, but nothing worked. Modern diagnoses range from schizophrenia to severe depression. Whatever the cause, the king was incapable of ruling. Margaret must have been somewhat comforted by the birth of her son Edward, the Prince of Wales, but rumors soon started swirling. Just as people accused her of sleeping with De la Pole, they now accused her of sleeping with the Duke of Somerset. After all, Henry was known to be extremely shy and uncomfortable with physical contact. He'd been married to Margaret for 8 years without getting her pregnant. Was the child actually his? Margaret needed the king to come to his senses and publicly proclaim Edward as his son and heir. In the meantime, the rule of England was taken over by Henry's competent and popular cousin Richard, the Duke of York. He was effectively the hand of the king, and in 1454 he took the title Protector of the Realm. Richard was critical of Henry's weak, corrupt, and ineffective advisors. He had attacked Margaret's friends De la Pole and Somerset. Some in Parliament had even called for Richard to be named Henry's heir, which would rob Margaret's newborn son of his birthright. Now that Richard was in charge, he was determined to clean house. Margaret drafted a bill to have herself declared regent. Richard ignored her. Instead, he cut the Queen out of all decision-making and imprisoned Somerset in the Tower of London. Meanwhile, Richard's supporters spread the rumor that Somerset was Margaret's lover. Her son, Edward, their bastard. Bastard or no, Edward would turn out to be a total Joffrey, but more on that later. Richard's political ambitions set him permanently at odds with Margaret. On top of everything else, the truth was that Richard actually had a better claim to the throne than Henry did. This was the beginning of the conflict between Henry's family, the House of Lancaster, and Richard's family, the House of York. This on-again, off-again civil war, the Wars of the Roses, would divide England for 30 years. At Christmas in 1454, Henry VI suddenly recovered his mental health. He proudly proclaimed Edward as his son, though he reportedly couldn't remember conceiving the child and considered him a miracle. What can we say? Henry was a very nice guy. With the king back on the throne, Richard was turfed out as Lord Protector. Somerset was freed from the Tower of London, and Margaret suddenly found herself in a stronger position than ever. Her husband was weak, unstable, and irresolute, making her the real ruler of the kingdom. But in 1455, Margaret's vengeful streak would set in motion a series of events that would lead to the downfall of her family. She summoned a council of all the great lords in the realm for the purpose of, quote, defending the king from his enemies. Richard and the House of York were not invited. Richard rightly interpreted this as Margaret openly plotting to murder him. So, Richard called in his banners and marched out with his army, claiming that his goal was to rescue the king from his evil counselors and his evil wife. The Wars of the Roses had begun. The Yorks went into battle against the Lancasters on May 22, 1455, at the First Battle of St. Albans. Unusually for the period, the battle took place in a town. It was actually more of a brawl, where the casualties were very light, but the Duke of Somerset was killed, and disastrously, Henry was captured. But Richard couldn't kill him. Had he done so, the crown would have passed to young Edward, with Margaret as regent. Richard needed Henry alive and on the throne as a weak puppet he could control, so he escorted the king back to London. Parliament duly reappointed Richard Protector of the Realm on the pretext that the king was again unwell. Henry made another recovery in 1456, and York was forced to give up that title. But this time there was no getting rid of him. With the 100 Years' War over, thousands of armed men returned to England. Powerful lords were dividing into factions, raising private armies, fighting against each other and the crown. A weak king like Henry had no chance. His only wish was to reconcile the warring factions. In 1458, he organized a well-meaning but completely ludicrous event called Love Day. He brought together all the lords who hated each other and forced them to parade through London holding hands. Margaret was paired up with Richard in what must have been a walk to remember. All the angry, vindictive lords brought armed men with them to Love Day, and the city was so full of guys looking for a fight that another battle almost broke out. In any case, it wouldn't be long until the Queen and the Duke of York were at each other's throats again, and the country would bleed. While the king was making them hold hands in public, behind the scenes both Margaret and Richard were preparing for war. In 1459, Margaret again summoned a Grand Council of Lords. Again, Richard and his friends weren't invited. He knew this could only mean one thing. The Queen was planning to arrest him for treason and execute him. Richard fled to Ireland, but that was alright because among his many titles he was Lieutenant of Ireland. The Irish backed him, which allowed him to land an army in England. While Henry, Margaret, and Edward were away from London, troops loyal to Richard marched into the city unopposed. Meanwhile, another York army cornered the royal family in Northamptonshire. In the ensuing battle, some of Margaret's men defected, which allowed the Yorks to raid the Lancaster camp. Margaret was only just able to escape with Edward, but Henry was typically unlucky. Again, he was captured, and again he was marched back to London, a prisoner in a crown. Richard returned to London in what he must have thought was triumph. Instead, something incredible happened. Richard marched into Parliament and tried to sit on the throne. He must have expected the lords there to cheer and proclaim him king. Instead, they greeted this gesture with awkward silence. Someone asked Richard if he had come to see the king. Richard replied, quote, "I know of no person in this realm the which oweth not to wait on me rather than I of him." In other words, dude, I am the king. The other lords were disgusted by Richard's arrogance. They made him Lord Protector again. They proclaimed that he and his sons would be Henry's heirs, but they refused to name him king or grant him any other honor. And if Richard counted Margaret out, he was a fool. Like her fictional counterpart, Margaret would never accept any usurper and would go down fighting to the death. Margaret and Edward fled to Scotland. At this time, Scotland was ruled by Queen Mary of Guelders as regent for her young son James III. Like any good Scottish ruler, Mary was happy to see the English fighting each other, and that was reason enough for her to welcome Margaret and Edward. But Margaret was angling for more than just a place to hide. She wanted her crown back, and she'd come to make a deal. She offered Edward's hand in marriage to Mary's daughter. In exchange, Mary offered an army to help Margaret rescue her husband. But Lancaster supporters were already gathering in the north of England, spurred on by Margaret's promise that they could loot their way to London if they beat the Yorkists. She wouldn't have to wait long for them to oblige her. In December of 1460, Richard and his allies rode north to confront Margaret's gathering army, which was commanded by Henry, Duke of Somerset, the son of Margaret's dead friend and reputed lover. Somerset avenged his father by crushing Richard's army at the Battle of Wakefield. Richard was killed in the fighting, and his head mounted on a spike atop the gates of York, wearing a paper crown. Margaret rushed south into England to command her army. In February of 1461, she was present when her troops scored another victory against the House of York at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Yes, another Battle of St. Albans, this poor town. Anyway, Henry was actually being held in the Yorkist camp, so Margaret was able to free him once again. It was after this battle that Margaret and her son Edward had the blood-curdling Cersei Joffrey moment with the two captured knights, the one we mentioned in the opening. More on that later. The royal couple prepared to march south to reclaim their throne, but they never got the chance. The people of London were against them. Instead, they'd risen in favor of a new king, Richard's son Edward, who we're going to call Eddie, since every English king is named either Edward, Henry, or Richard, and it gets confusing very fast. Eddie was obviously enraged by the defeat, death, and public humiliation of his father. He hightailed it to London, where he found enough support to declare himself King Edward IV, raise an army, and march north to avenge his father. When the Yorkists faced the Lancastrian army on a snowy March day, they found themselves heavily outnumbered. But Eddie, like his father, was a dynamic commander who led from the front. Margaret, by contrast, was holed up in the rear with Henry, who was unable to fight, and Edward, who was 7 years old. What followed was the Battle of Towton, the deadliest battle ever fought on British soil. For the time, the number of men present was astonishing. Perhaps 2% of the entire population of the country fought in this battle. Eddie led the House of York to a crushing victory, putting Margaret's army to rout and killing many powerful Lancaster supporters. Margaret was once again forced to flee to Scotland, but this time she brought both her son and husband with her. It was 1461. Margaret was 31 years old, and she'd reached the lowest point of her life. Stripped of her crown, her husband deposed, her son disinherited, most of her lords and knights dead, imprisoned, or defected to the House of York. But she wasn't finished. She would never accept defeat, and she still had one shocking comeback up her sleeve. In 1463, Margaret left Scotland and went to France to beg for aid, taking her son along. Henry stayed behind. Little did the royal couple know this would be their final parting. The Scots decided to make peace with Eddie. This forced Henry to leave Scotland and return to England. The former king still had supporters and troops loyal to him, but these were weak and dispersed, and he was a fugitive in his own kingdom, sneaking from castle to castle. In 1464, Henry was captured again. Seriously, this dude's whole life was a game of capture the flag, and he was the flag. Once again, Henry was more use alive than dead, so Eddie locked him in the Tower of London. Margaret, meanwhile, found sympathy from her cousin, King Louis XI of France, but no substantial assistance was forthcoming until Eddie made a crucial mistake. Eddie had been in negotiations to marry Louis's daughter. Instead, he secretly married a minor noblewoman named Elizabeth Woodville, and gave her many relatives lands, titles, and powerful marriage alliances. This enraged both the King of France and Eddie's supporters, most especially the powerful Earl of Warwick. Warwick came to France and met with Margaret. She agreed to speak with him, after making him kneel at her feet in silence for 15 minutes. Such a Cersei. By the way, it was at this time that Margaret's son Edward, now a teenager, really earned his reputation as a stupid, cruel brat. A courtier left this account of him, quote, "He already talks of nothing but cutting off heads or making war, as if he had everything in his hands, or was the god of battle, or the peaceful occupant of the throne." End quote. Margaret agreed to marry her son to Warwick's daughter in exchange for him invading England on her behalf. Warwick agreed. He landed in England, rallying other disaffected lords to his side. Now Eddie was forced to flee, and on October 3, 1470, Henry was freed from the Tower of London and reinstated as king. Margaret and Edward had remained behind in France. In April of 1471, they crossed the English Channel, finally ready to return to power. On the exact day they landed, Eddie's forces defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. Henry was again deposed, again locked in the Tower of London. Margaret took command of her troops and faced off against Eddie one final time at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her army was smashed, and her son was killed in the fighting. Margaret had of course faced many reversals in her life, but this time her spirit was finally broken. She surrendered to Eddie, who stuck her in a chariot and paraded her through London in disgrace, a sour reprise of her celebrated first arrival in the city 26 years earlier. Margaret was imprisoned in the Tower of London. That very night, the 21st of May, 1471, Henry was murdered in that same tower, on Eddie's orders. With his son dead, the old king had finally outlived his usefulness. Eddie didn't kill Margaret. She was released into the custody of her old friend Alice, Duchess of Suffolk, until Louis XI finally paid her ransom in 1475. She returned to her native France, where she lived out the rest of her days as a penniless noblewoman, dependent on the charity of rich relatives. Margaret of Anjou, this formidable, ruthless, indomitable woman, died quietly 7 years later at the age of 52. An ignoble end for a woman who had acquired such a reputation for ruthlessness. On that note, we should revisit Margaret's most Cersei-like moment. After the Second Battle of St. Albans, when she rescued Henry, she also captured those two Yorkist knights, William Bonville and Thomas Cyril. They had been assigned to protect Henry during the battle, and he had promised them immunity. But Margaret wasn't in a forgiving mood, and insisted the two men be tried for treason. Then she called forth her son, who was 7 years old at the time, and had him preside over this trial, saying, "Fair son, what deaths shall these knights die?" To which Edward gleefully demanded that their heads be chopped off, and so it was done. Maybe Edward was more like Robin Arryn after all. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like and a comment, and subscribe to History Snob for more. Thanks for watching.